Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really controversial idea, one that kind of flips geopolitics on its head, the claim that the end of the American-led world order isn't an accident, but actually a deliberate plan.
We're exploring a pretty provocative perspective that's been gaining some traction, and it asks a really startling question. What if the United States is actively and purposefully engineering its own decline?
And look, according to this view, the decline isn't some far-off prediction. It's a declaration that the American empire, as it's called, is already over. This sets the stage for what is honestly a pretty compelling and unsettling story.
So, if this decline is really happening, who's to blame? This is where the argument takes its first, really surprising turn. It suggests the push isn't coming from outside, but from within.
So here's the central claim. All those recent U.S. geopolitical moves, the ones that look like big blunders, well, in this view, they're not mistakes at all. They're actually seen as deliberate, calculated steps in a much larger strategy of a, managed decline.
Okay, so what does a managed decline even look like in practice? Well, this argument points to a whole series of specific geopolitical events that seem designed to create instability. Let's take a real-world example. You have this major nuclear deal between the US and Russia. It gets canceled right after presidential comment. Now the conventional take? That's a diplomatic failure, right? But this argument sees it completely differently. It sees a deliberate provocation, a self-inflicted wound, if you will, designed specifically to weaken the U.S. position and stir up instability. And this isn't just a one-off thing. It's seen as part of this bigger trend, a huge push away from what's called a unipolar system. You got nations around the world actively demanding a multipolar world, one where power is shared between several major players, instead of being dominated by just one superpower.
But here's the thing. These geopolitical moves, they're described as just the symptoms. The real engine driving this whole alleged decline, according to this viewpoint, is all about the economy.
The entire argument really hinges on one core concept: de-dollarization. Now, usually when you hear that term, it means other countries are ditching the dollar. But here's the big twist. This viewpoint claims the whole process is actually being led by the United States itself, deliberately. And what's the main weapon in this strategy? Well, proponents of this viewpoint write to this number, $16 trillion. That's the staggering amount of new money supposedly printed in just the last few years. The idea is, if you flood the world with dollars, you intentionally weaken its value. You make it less attractive, and you basically force other countries to start looking for alternatives. And get this, it's presented as a totally bipartisan project, just with different branding. You have Republicans using tariffs and that whole America First slogan to pull back from the global economy. Then you have Democrats using sanctions and, moral arguments to achieve a really similar kind of economic isolation. So, according to this perspective, it's just two different roads leading to the exact same place, a world where the dollar plays a much smaller role.
And this, right here, is the absolute crucial point that flips the entire narrative on its head. It argues that the U.S. isn't a victim of de-dollarization, it's the main architect. It's intentionally taking apart its own economic empire.
Okay, so this argument doesn't just stop with economics and geopolitics. Not at all. It goes way further, predicting some pretty profound and, frankly, disruptive consequences for society, especially here in the West.
So this perspective draws a direct line, a 50-year-long one, connecting the dots. It starts with the beginning of large-scale dollar printing back in the 70s, links it to what it calls the rise of extreme capitalism, and then brings it to today, where it describes the traditional family unit as being destroyed. And the final step? A warning of a massive social crisis just over the horizon, within the next 10 years. And that predicted crisis? It's incredibly stark. The argument claims that within a decade, we're going to see a huge demographic of unmarried, childless, and jobless women emerge across the Western world. And it says this is a direct consequence of these economic shifts.
And that leads to what is probably the argument's most controversial social prediction. It claims that this demographic will then turn to the government for financial support, demanding, and this is the quote, to tax the men to give me free money. It's a view that suggests a fundamental change to the social contract.
Okay, so If this perspective is right, and the old system is being torn down on purpose, what comes next? What's supposed to be built in its place?
Well, one of the first things predicted to go is the value of the education system. The argument is that by 2030, a whole lot of traditional degrees will basically be worthless. And when mass layoffs happen, they won't be blamed on this big economic reset. No, they'll be hidden behind a much more convenient cover story, the AI bubble.
This all leads to a complete reversal of how we normally think about global power. There's this common belief that big export-driven economies, like India, absolutely need the huge U.S. consumer market to survive.
But this argument just flips that script completely. It claims that a nation with a strong currency and real actual industrial production is fundamentally wealthier and ultimately way less dependent than a country that's just propped up by printing money and buying imports.
So to wrap this all up, what we have here is a vision of the world where America's decline is a deliberate, self-inflicted act. De-dollarization is the main tool, driven by printing massive amounts of currency. Both major political parties are seen as pushing toward the same goal. And the predicted result? A pretty severe long-term social breakdown in the West, all of which paves the way for a brand new multipolar world.
It's a provocative, and let's be honest, deeply unsettling picture of the future. So whether you look at this and see a conspiracy, or you see a compelling explanation for what's happening in the world, it forces all of us to grapple with a really critical question. If the global system we've all known is ending, whether by design or just by default, what in the world is going to be built in its place?